A traffic stop on a rainy night, a Harvard-educated doctor in scrubs, a young cop with a badge number tattooed on his wrist, and too much anger in his eyes. But this isn't just another headline about bias and power. It's about wounds that run deeper than skin, secrets locked in 15-year-old security footage, and a father's last words that could either heal or destroy. Some storms come to reveal what's been hiding in plain sight. Dr. Marcus Johnson rubbed his tired eyes as he pulled his Mercedes into his reserved parking spot at St. Elizabeth's Hospital. The digital clock on his dashboard read 2:47 a.m., another late night in the emergency department. As chief of emergency medicine, he'd gotten used to the irregular hours, but tonight had been particularly grueling after a multiple vehicle accident brought in 6 critical patients simultaneously. The streets of Millbrook were quiet at this hour, a peaceful suburban town that prided itself on its low crime rate and excellent schools. Marcus had moved here 5 years ago, drawn by the prestigious hospital position and the promise of a better life for his teenage daughter, Sophia. Being one of the few black families in the predominantly white community had its challenges, but Marcus believed that excellence was the best answer to prejudice. As he drove down Maple Avenue toward his home in the Hamilton Heights neighborhood, he noticed the flash of red and blue lights in his rearview mirror. Suppressing a sigh, he pulled over, following the routine he'd practiced with Sophia countless times. Hands visible on the steering wheel, interior light on, registration and insurance within easy reach. Officer James Sullivan approached the vehicle with his hand resting on his holstered weapon. Standard procedure, but it still made Marcus's heart rate quicken. At 45 years old, with salt and pepper hair and wearing green hospital scrubs under his white coat, Marcus knew he hardly looked threatening, yet experience had taught him that appearances didn't always matter. "License and registration," Officer Sullivan demanded, his flashlight beam darting around the car's interior before settling uncomfortably on Marcus's face. "Good evening, officer," Marcus replied calmly, his Harvard Medical School class ring catching the light as he reached slowly for his credentials. "May I ask why I was stopped?" "You were doing 40 in a 35 zone, and your right taillight is out." Sullivan's tone was clipped, suspicious. He was young, probably in his late 20s, with close-cropped blonde hair and a face that looked like it didn't smile often. "I apologize about the speed, officer. I wasn't aware of the taillight. I'll have it fixed first thing tomorrow." Marcus handed over his license and registration with deliberate movements. Sullivan studied the documents with exaggerated scrutiny. "This is a nice car for a hospital janitor," he remarked, his voice dripping with insinuation. Marcus felt his jaw tighten, but kept his voice steady. "I'm not a janitor, officer. I'm the chief of emergency medicine at St. Elizabeth's. I'm just heading home after a long shift." "Sure you are," Sullivan scoffed. "Step out of the vehicle, please." "Officer, I've just finished a 12-hour shift treating accident victims. I have my hospital ID right here." Marcus reached toward the lanyard hanging from his rearview mirror. "I said step out of the vehicle." Sullivan's hand moved to his weapon, both hands where I can see them. Marcus's mind raced. He thought of Sophia at home, probably still awake studying for her AP exams. He thought of his late wife Marie, who'd always told him to keep his cool no matter what. He thought of his patients who needed him to be back at work in just a few hours. "Officer Sullivan," he said, reading the nameplate on the young cop's uniform, "I understand you're doing your job, but I think there's been a misunderstanding. I'm happy to comply, but I'd like to contact my attorney first if you're asking me to exit my vehicle." Sullivan's face reddened. "You can call your attorney from the station, out of the car now." The situation was escalating quickly. Marcus could feel his medical training kicking in. Assess the situation, remain calm, identify the best course of action to prevent harm. He noticed another patrol car pulling up behind them, its lights also flashing. A second officer stepped out, an older man with graying hair and a weathered face. Marcus recognized him as Sergeant David Chen, who had brought his daughter to the ER last year after she broke her arm in a soccer game. "Everything all right here, Sullivan?" Chen asked, approaching the scene with measured steps. "This suspect is being uncooperative," Sullivan reported. "Claims he's a doctor, probably stolen vehicle." "Dr. Johnson?" Chen's voice carried a note of recognition. "What brings you out so late?" The tension in the air shifted slightly. Sullivan's hand moved away from his weapon, though his posture remained rigid. "Sergeant Chen," Marcus acknowledged with relief. "Multiple vehicle accident tonight. just heading home. Chen turned to his younger colleague. Officer Sullivan, I can vouch for Dr. Johnson. He treated my Emma last year when she broke her arm. He's the chief of emergency medicine at St. Elizabeth's. Sullivan's face went through a complex series of emotions: disbelief, embarrassment, and something darker that Marcus couldn't quite identify. The young officer's grip tightened on his flashlight. Protocol still requires, Sullivan began, but Chen cut him off. I'll handle this, officer. You can return to your patrol. Sullivan stood frozen for a moment, jaw working silently. Marcus could almost see the internal struggle playing out behind the young officer's eyes. Finally, he handed back Marcus's license and registration with a stiff motion. But this wasn't the end of the story. As Sullivan stalked back to his patrol car, Marcus could tell this encounter would have ripples extending far beyond this late-night traffic stop. The look in the young officer's eyes suggested this wasn't over, and Marcus had been around long enough to know that wounded pride could be more dangerous than open hostility. The following morning, as Marcus recounted the incident to his daughter over breakfast, Sophia's expression grew increasingly troubled. Dad, you have to report him. This kind of thing keeps happening because people don't speak up. Marcus stirred his coffee thoughtfully. It's not that simple, sweetheart. Officer Sullivan is young. He made a mistake. A mistake that could have gotten you killed. Sophia's voice cracked with emotion. What if Sergeant Chen hadn't shown up? Before Marcus could respond, his phone buzzed with a text from the hospital administrator. There had been a complaint filed. Apparently, Officer Sullivan had some concerns about a doctor who might be impersonating staff at St. Elizabeth's. Marcus set his phone down and looked at his daughter's worried face. He thought about all the times he'd told her that change comes through education and understanding, not confrontation. But he also thought about the responsibility he had, not just to himself and Sophia, but to his community, and to the next person Officer Sullivan might stop. The story was far from over, and the real test of character, for both Marcus and Officer Sullivan, was just beginning. That afternoon, Marcus sat in Chief Administrator Barbara Wells's office, his hospital ID badge placed conspicuously on her desk between them. The morning's complaint had escalated quickly, drawing scrutiny from the hospital board. I've known you for 5 years, Marcus, Barbara said, her fingers drumming against her mahogany desk. But we have to follow procedure. Officer Sullivan's report suggests potential identity theft concerns. Barbara, you hired me yourself, Marcus replied, keeping his voice level despite his growing frustration. My credentials are on file. My face is literally on the hospital website. I know, she waved her hand dismissively. But the police department has some influence with our board members, and Sullivan's father is apparently close friends with Dr. Johnson. A breathless nurse burst into the office without knocking. Multiple GSW victims coming in, 5 minutes out. Marcus stood immediately, doctor mode engaging. We'll have to continue this later, Barbara. She nodded, understanding that saving lives took precedence over politics. We're not done discussing this. In the ER, Marcus found himself working alongside Dr. Sarah Martinez, a talented young resident he'd been mentoring. As they rushed to stabilize a teenage gunshot victim, she whispered, I heard about what happened last night. The whole staff is talking about it. Focus on the patient, Dr. Martinez, Marcus instructed, though he appreciated her concern. The victim's blood pressure was dropping dangerously low. Hours later, after successfully saving both gunshot victims, Marcus finally had a moment to check his phone. 3 missed calls from Sophia, 1 from his lawyer, and a text from Sergeant Chen. Need to talk? Important. Before he could respond to any of them, he spotted Officer Sullivan in the ER waiting room, speaking to one of the shooting victim's family members. Their eyes met briefly across the room. Sullivan was in uniform, presumably taking statements, but his presence felt like more than a coincidence. The young officer made his way over, each step deliberate. Dr. Johnson, he said, emphasizing the title with what might have been sarcasm. I need to ask you a few questions about these shooting victims. Of course, officer. Marcus gestured to an empty consultation room, aware of the staff watching their interaction. As they entered the small room, he left the door open, a precaution that shouldn't have been necessary in his own hospital. You treated both victims? Sullivan's tone was professional, but there was an underlying tension in his posture. Yes, along with Dr. Martinez and our trauma team. And you're certain they were random victims? No gang affiliations? Marcus felt his shoulders tighten. Officer Sullivan, I treat patients regardless of their background. My job is to save lives, not make assumptions about... Like I made assumptions about you? Sullivan interrupted, his voice low. Is that what you're implying? The air in the room grew heavy with unspoken accusations. Before Marcus could respond, a familiar figure appeared in the doorway. James, Sergeant Chen said quietly, I'll take it from here. Sullivan's face flushed, but he nodded stiffly and left. Chen closed the door behind him. That boy's got a lot to learn, Chen sighed. But there's something you should know, Dr. Johnson. Something about why he is the way he is. Meanwhile, across town, Sophia sat in her AP history class, unable to focus on the lesson about civil rights movements. Her phone buzzed silently, a message from a classmate linking to a social media post. Someone had filmed part of her father's traffic stop the night before, and the video was starting to circulate. The timestamp showed 1:47 p.m. In just 4 hours, the video would reach local news stations. In 5 hours, it would catch the attention of national media. In 6 hours, both St. Elizabeth's Hospital and the Millbrook Police Department would face unprecedented scrutiny, and Officer James Sullivan, sitting in his patrol car outside the hospital, was about to make a decision that would change everything. James lost his father in a hospital, Sergeant Chen explained, settling into one of the consultation room chairs. Right here at St. Elizabeth's, actually, before your time. Marcus leaned against the examination table, sensing there was more to the story. Outside, the usual bustle of the ER continued, monitors beeping, nurses calling out to each other, the squeak of gurney wheels on linoleum. His father was a cop too, Chen continued. Shot during a routine traffic stop. The suspect was never caught. When they brought him here, Chen paused, choosing his words carefully. The attending physician was Dr. William Carter, African-American doctor, about your age now. Did everything he could, but James's father didn't make it. And let me guess, Marcus said quietly. Sullivan blamed Dr. Carter. James was 16, impressionable. His mother had already passed years before, and his father was everything to him. Dr. Carter received death threats afterward, had to relocate to Chicago. Chen's weathered face showed the weight of the memory. James joined the force as soon as he was old enough. I thought keeping him under my wing might help him work through some of that anger, but... Before Chen could finish, both their phones buzzed simultaneously. The video of last night's traffic stop had just gone viral. The shaky footage, shot from a nearby house, showed Sullivan with his hand on his weapon, Marcus's calm attempts to de-escalate, and Chen's intervention. Chief wants us both in his office, now, Chen said, checking his message. This is about to get complicated. At the same moment, in Sophia's history class, the video was spreading like wildfire through students' phones. Her teacher, Ms. Reynolds, had already pulled it up on the classroom smartboard, turning the day's civil rights lesson into a real-time discussion about modern prejudice. That's my dad, Sophia said quietly. But in the silent classroom, everyone heard her. 30 pairs of eyes turned to stare. Sophia, Ms. Reynolds began, but was interrupted by the school principal's voice over the intercom, requesting Sophia's presence in the office immediately. Back at the hospital, Marcus found his inbox flooding with interview requests from local and national media. Barbara Wells had called an emergency board meeting, and his phone wouldn't stop ringing, but his attention was drawn to a different scene unfolding in the ER parking lot. Officer Sullivan sat in his patrol car, gripping his steering wheel so tight his knuckles were white. Through the windshield, Marcus could see him watching the hospital entrance. Sullivan's body camera light was off. A new text message appeared on Marcus's phone, from his old friend and colleague, Dr. William Carter in Chicago. Just saw the video, history repeating itself. Be careful, Marcus. Sullivan came to my house the night before I left town. Never reported it. Some wounds don't heal, they just get passed down. In the police chief's office, Sergeant Chen stood before his superior, trying to explain the situation. But the chief's attention was on his computer screen, where multiple windows showed the video spreading across social media platforms. Comments were pouring in, hashtags were trending, and the department's phone lines were jammed with calls. "Where is Sullivan now?" the chief demanded. Chen checked his phone. No response to his last 3 messages to James. At St. Elizabeth's, Marcus stepped out into the parking lot. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows between the cars, and the air had the heavy feeling that preceded a storm. He could see Sullivan's patrol car, and Sullivan could certainly see him. This was the moment to either walk away or walk toward the car, to let the video tell the story or to try writing a different ending, to let the wounds of the past fester or to attempt healing them. Thunder rumbled in the distance as Marcus made his choice. Behind him, Sophia's car pulled into the parking lot. She'd left school early after seeing the video. And somewhere in Chicago, Dr. William Carter was booking a flight to Millbrook, knowing that some stories need to be faced in person. Officer Sullivan watched Dr. Johnson's approach through his windshield, his hand moving to rest on his holstered weapon out of habit. But this time, the gesture carried the weight of a deeper history, one that connected two doctors, two officers, and two generations of pain. The first drops of rain began to fall as Marcus approached Sullivan's patrol car. Each step felt heavy with purpose, like walking through memory itself. Behind him, he could hear Sophia's voice calling out, but he kept moving forward. Some conversations needed to happen face to face. Sullivan watched through the windshield, his expression a complex mix of anger, fear, and something else, something that looked almost like grief. He stepped out of the car just as the rain began to fall harder, his uniform already darkening with moisture. "My father died right there," Sullivan said without preamble, pointing to the emergency entrance. 15 years ago, Dr. Carter couldn't save him. His voice cracked slightly on the name. "I know," Marcus replied softly. "Sergeant Chen told me." "You don't know anything," Sullivan snapped, but his usual aggressive edge was dulled by exhaustion. "You don't know what it's like to watch your father die while a doctor just stands there saying, 'We did everything we could.'" Thunder crashed overhead, and the rain fell in earnest now. Neither man moved to seek shelter. "Actually, I do," Marcus said, his voice barely audible above the storm. "I lost my wife Marie in a hospital. Different city, different circumstances, but the same words. We did everything we could. My daughter Sophia was 12. Sullivan's face flickered with surprise, then uncertainty. Behind them, Sophia stood frozen under the hospital overhang, watching the scene unfold through the curtain of rain. "The video's everywhere," Sullivan said finally. "I'll probably lose my badge." "Is that what you want?" Marcus asked. "To lose your badge? To prove everyone right about who you are?" Before Sullivan could answer, a new voice cut through the rain. "It's not what his father would have wanted." They turned to see an older black man approaching, carrying a small suitcase. Despite the rain, his suit was impeccable, his bearing dignified. Dr. William Carter had made record time from Chicago. "Dr. Carter," Sullivan breathed, taking an involuntary step backward. "Hello, James," Carter said gently. "You've grown, though maybe not as much as you should have." The rain continued to pour as the four of them stood in the parking lot, Marcus, Sullivan, Carter, and Sophia, still watching from the overhang. 15 years of pain, prejudice, and misunderstanding hung in the air between them. "Your father was a good man," Carter continued, moving closer to Sullivan. "We talked, you know, while the surgical team was preparing. His last words weren't about hate or blame. They were about you." Sullivan's hand, which had been hovering near his weapon, fell limply to his side. What did he say?" Inside the hospital, Barbara Wells stood at her office window, watching the scene below. Her phone was ringing again, probably another reporter. The video had now reached over 1 million views. On her desk lay 2 letters. One was a formal complaint against Dr. Johnson from the police department, dated that morning. The other was a letter of support signed by every doctor and nurse in the emergency department. Sergeant Chen's patrol car pulled into the parking lot, lights flashing, but sirens silent. He stepped out into the rain, moving quickly toward the group. He carried a folder, personnel files that might finally reveal the full story of that night 15 years ago. The storm intensified, but none of them moved. Some truths needed to be spoken in the rain, where tears could mix with the falling water, and old wounds could begin to be washed clean. Dr. Carter reached into his suit jacket and withdrew an aged, folded piece of paper. "I've carried your father's last words with me for 15 years, James, waiting for the right moment, waiting for you to be ready to hear them." Sullivan's face crumpled slightly, years of carefully constructed barriers beginning to crack. Behind him, his patrol car's dashboard camera continued to record, capturing a very different kind of encounter than the one from the previous night. and somewhere in the hospital's security office, an old VHS tape from 15 years ago waited to be discovered, footage that would show what really happened the night Officer Sullivan Sr. was brought in, footage that would challenge everything his son thought he knew about that tragic night. Dr. Carter's hands trembled slightly as he unfolded the weathered paper, its creases deep from years of being carried, hidden, waited upon. The rain had softened to a gentle mist, catching the glow of the hospital lights like suspended stars. "Before I read this," Carter said, looking directly at Sullivan, "there's something you need to see first." He nodded to Sergeant Chen, who stepped forward with his folder. "Security footage from that night," Chen explained, protected from the rain by a clear plastic sleeve. "Took some digging, but we found it archived in the basement. Shows everything that happened in the ER." Sullivan's face went pale. "I know what happened. I was there." "You were 16 and in shock," Carter said gently. "What you remember and what actually happened, they might be two different things." Sophia had moved closer now, standing near her father. The resemblance between them was striking, the same determined set of their jaws, the same compassionate eyes. She pulled out her phone, where the viral video of last night's traffic stop was still playing silently on her screen. "We should watch it inside," Marcus suggested, gesturing toward the hospital. "My office." The group moved through the emergency department, drawing curious glances from staff and patients. Barbara Wells met them at Marcus's office door, her expression grave but hopeful. A small TV had been set up, its screen dark and waiting. As Chen inserted the old tape, Sullivan sank into a chair, looking suddenly young and vulnerable. The footage began to play, the timestamp showing 11:47 p.m. 15 years ago. The grainy video showed the ER entrance bursting open, paramedics rushing in with Officer Sullivan Sr. on a gurney. Behind them, a teenage James Sullivan followed, his face streaked with tears. And there was Dr. Carter, already moving to meet them, his white coat flaring as he ran. What happened next caught everyone's breath. The footage showed Dr. Carter working tirelessly, his hands moving with desperate precision. It showed him performing CPR long after others would have stopped, sweat soaking through his scrubs. It showed him refusing to give up even when other doctors suggested calling time of death. But most importantly, it showed something James Sullivan had forgotten or never seen through his grief-stricken haze. His father regaining consciousness briefly, Dr. Carter leaning close to hear his words. The office was silent except for the soft whir of the tape player. Present-day Sullivan leaned forward, straining to read his father's lips on the grainy footage. Carter's hand moved to the folded paper in his pocket. "That's when he gave me this message," Carter said quietly. "Right before—" A knock at the office door interrupted them. A nurse poked her head in, looking apologetic but urgent. "Dr. Johnson, there's been a major accident on the highway. Multiple casualties incoming." Marcus stood immediately, doctor's instincts kicking in. But before he could move toward the door, Sullivan spoke up. "Let me see it," he said, eyes fixed on the paper in Carter's hand. "Please, I need to know what my father said." Outside the office, the ER burst into activity as ambulance sirens grew closer. The past and present seemed to merge in that moment. Another tragic night, another chance to save lives, another opportunity to bridge the divide between perception and reality. Carter looked at Marcus, then at Sullivan, then at the unfolding emergency beyond the office doors. Sometimes life presents multiple urgencies at once, and the true test of character is choosing which wounds to heal first. "Go," Carter said to Marcus. "Save lives. That's what this has always been about." He turned to Sullivan, holding out the folded paper. "And you need to read this alone first." Marcus hesitated for a moment before heading to the ER, Sophia following close behind. She'd spent enough time at the hospital to know how to help, organizing supplies, comforting families, being her father's eyes and ears when he was deep in trauma surgery. Sullivan took the paper with shaking hands but didn't unfold it. "I'm not sure I'm ready." "Your father was ready for you to hear it 15 years ago," Carter said softly. "The question is, are you ready to let go of who you thought he wanted you to be?" In the ER, the first victims were arriving. Marcus worked with mechanical precision, his mind split between the immediate crisis and the unfolding drama in his office. As he cut away a crash victim's clothing, he could see Sullivan through the office window, still holding the unopened paper. Multiple lacerations, possible internal bleeding, Dr. Martinez reported, working alongside Marcus. Just like that night 15 years ago. Marcus's hand stilled for a fraction of a second. "You were here?" "I was a nursing student," she replied, adjusting an IV line. "I watched Dr. Carter work on Officer Sullivan Sr. I've never seen anyone fight so hard to save a life." In the office, Sullivan finally unfolded the paper. His face crumpled as he recognized his father's handwriting. Not Dr. Carter's words, but his father's actual last message, written in hurried, shaky script during a brief moment of consciousness. Outside, news vans were arriving, their satellite dishes reaching up into the misty night sky. The story had evolved from a viral video of police bias to something more complex. A story about generational trauma, about assumptions and their costs, about the possibility of healing old wounds while tending to new ones. Sophia moved between trauma rooms, delivering supplies and updates. She paused at the office door, watching Sullivan read. Through the glass, she saw him cover his mouth with one hand, tears streaming down his face. Sergeant Chen stood in the hallway, fielding calls from the police chief. The video had sparked internal investigations, calls for reform, demands for accountability. But Chen kept thinking about the young officer he'd mentored and how sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest shifts in perspective. Barbara Wells moved through the ER, watching her staff handle both the immediate crisis and the unfolding human drama. The hospital's phones were ringing off the hook. Reporters, community leaders, activists. Everyone wanted to know how a traffic stop had led to this moment. In the trauma room, Marcus called out for more blood products. The patient on his table was crashing, just as Officer Sullivan Sr. had 15 years ago. But this time, something was different. The office door opened. Sullivan emerged, his face tear-streaked but determined. He'd changed. Something fundamental had shifted in his expression. Without a word, he walked into the trauma room, still clutching his father's letter. "What do you need?" he asked Marcus, rolling up his sleeves. "I'm certified in emergency response. Let me help." The monitors beeped urgently. The patient's blood pressure was dropping. History hung in the balance, waiting to either repeat itself or take a different path. And there, in the sharp hospital lights, a black doctor and a white police officer stood shoulder to shoulder, fighting together to save a life. Dr. Carter watched from the doorway, the weight of 15 years lifting slightly from his shoulders. The truth had finally emerged, not just from his father's letter, but from Sullivan's choice in this moment. Sometimes the biggest acts of courage aren't grand gestures, but small decisions to be better than our past selves. Rain continued to fall outside, washing away old prejudices drop by drop, and somewhere in the hospital's security system, a new video was being recorded, one that would tell a very different story than the viral traffic stop that had started it all. Time seemed to slow in the trauma room as Marcus and Sullivan worked together to save the crash victim. Their movements became synchronized, years of respective training merging into a seamless effort. The letter in Sullivan's pocket seemed to pulse with each beat of the patient's heart monitor. "Pressure's stabilizing," Dr. Martinez announced, relief evident in her voice. Sullivan reached for more gauze, his sleeve riding up to reveal a tattoo, his father's badge number. Marcus caught the glimpse but stayed focused on their patient, a young woman about Sophia's age. Her parents would be arriving soon, their world hanging on the outcome of this night. Outside the trauma room, Dr. Carter had begun speaking with reporters, his dignified presence commanding attention. 15 years ago, I couldn't save one life in this very room, he said, his voice carrying the weight of memory. But tonight, we might save more than just the patients in these beds. The patient stabilized enough for transfer to surgery. As the surgical team wheeled her away, Sullivan finally pulled out the letter. His hands were steady now, steadier than they'd been earlier. Perhaps saving a life had given him the strength to face his father's last words. "You should read it," he said to Marcus, holding out the worn paper. "You need to know what kind of man my father really was." The letter was short, written in the desperate scrawl of a dying man. "James, if you're reading this, I didn't make it. Dr. Carter did everything he could. I can see it in his eyes. The same determination I've seen in every good cop I've ever known. The man who shot me was white, son. Remember that. It's not about color. It's about character. Dr. Carter has it. Don't let my death make you less than you are. Don't let fear turn to hate. Be better than the world expects you to be. Love, Dad. Marcus read the words twice, understanding flooding through him. All these years, Sullivan had carried the weight of assumptions about his father's death, about Dr. Carter, about black men in positions of authority. The truth had been waiting patiently in Dr. Carter's pocket, waiting for the right moment to heal a wound that had festered far too long. Sophia appeared in the doorway, her phone displaying a new development. The video of their current collaboration in the trauma room had somehow leaked, spreading even faster than the traffic stop footage. Side by side, the two videos told a story of transformation that was capturing the nation's attention. Barbara Wells was already fielding calls from hospital boards across the country, asking about their diversity and bias training programs. The police department was experiencing a similar flood of inquiries. Change was rippling outward, touching institutions far beyond Millbrook. But in the quiet of the trauma room, something more personal was happening. Sullivan reached for his badge, running his fingers over the metal, as if seeing it for the first time. "I need to tell you about what happened last night," he said to Marcus. "About why I really pulled you over, about all the times I've done the same to others, about the man I thought I was supposed to be, and the man my father actually wanted me to become." Outside, more emergency vehicles were arriving. The night wasn't over. There would be more lives to save, more truths to face, more chances to choose between perpetuating old prejudices or forging new understandings. Dr. Carter approached, carrying a box of old incident reports, cases where Sullivan had demonstrated potentially biased behavior. "This isn't about punishment," he said, setting the box down. "It's about growth, about making things right." Thunder rolled in the distance as the storm prepared for another round. But inside the hospital, a different kind of storm was breaking. One that had been building for 15 years, one that might finally clear the air. The trauma room's fluorescent lights hummed softly as Sullivan began to speak, ready at last to confront not just his father's final words, but his own choices, his own biases, his own path forward. Sometimes the hardest person to face isn't the other, it's the reflection in the mirror, the one wearing the badge, carrying the wound, holding on to a story that was never really true. "I've stopped 73 black drivers in the past year," Sullivan began, his voice steady but heavy with realization. "3 white drivers. I told myself it was about suspicious behavior, but..." He gestured to the incident reports in the box. "The numbers don't lie. Neither did my father." Marcus listened as Sullivan detailed each stop, each assumption, each moment where bias had masqueraded as instinct. Sophia recorded everything on her phone with Sullivan's permission. Not for social media, but for the police department's new training program they were already discussing. "Your father's letter," Marcus said finally. "He wrote it, knowing Dr. Carter would carry it all these years. He trusted a black man to deliver his last words to his son. That says everything about who he really was." The next few weeks transformed Millbrook. Sullivan voluntarily attended bias training sessions, then began leading them himself, sharing his story with other officers. The viral videos, both the traffic stop and the trauma room collaboration, became teaching tools in police academies nationwide. Dr. Carter accepted a position as chief of surgery at St. Elizabeth's, returning to the hospital he'd fled 15 years ago. His first action was to establish a community outreach program, bridging the gap between law enforcement and medical professionals. Sophia's college application essay about that night earned her early acceptance to several medical schools. She wrote about watching her father and Officer Sullivan work together, about how healing comes in many forms, about how some wounds need more than just medicine to mend. Barbara Wells implemented new policies at St. Elizabeth's, requiring regular bias training for all staff. The hospital became a model for others, demonstrating how institutional change begins with personal transformation. 1 year later, Marcus and Sullivan stood together at the dedication of the Sullivan Senior Memorial Center for Community Healing, a joint project between the hospital and police department. The center would serve as both a medical clinic and a training facility, where doctors and officers would learn to work together, to see beyond assumptions, to heal both bodies and biases. "My father would have loved this," Sullivan said, touching the center's dedication plaque. "This is what he meant by being better than the world expects." Dr. Carter, now a regular speaker on institutional bias in healthcare and law enforcement, often used the Sullivan case as an example of how change happens. not through force or shame, but through understanding and the courage to face uncomfortable truths. The final piece of security footage from that transformative night showed something remarkable. Sullivan removing his badge, not in surrender, but in reflection, before pinning it back on with a new sense of purpose. The gesture became a ritual at the training center. Officers would remove their badges, reflect on their power and responsibility, then recommit to wearing them with true honor. Sophia, following in her father's footsteps at medical school, kept both videos on her phone. Some people think racism ends with big gestures, she told her classmates during a presentation. But real change happens in small moments, when we choose to see each other as people first, when we let go of old stories and write new ones together. Marcus kept Officer Sullivan Sr.'s letter framed in his office next to his medical degree. Its presence reminded every visitor that healing isn't just about medicine. It's about acknowledging wounds, understanding their origins, and having the courage to help them truly heal. The story of that night spread far beyond Millbrook, teaching an essential lesson, that sometimes the deepest wounds are the ones we can't see, and the greatest healers are those who dare to look deeper, to understand more, to be better than anyone expected them to be. In the end, it wasn't just about a racist cop and a black doctor. It was about how pain passes through generations until someone is brave enough to break the cycle, how healing requires both truth and grace, how change begins not with a viral video or a dramatic confrontation, but with the simple, powerful choice to see each other's humanity. And in Millbrook, where two men's paths crossed on a rainy night, that choice continued to ripple outward, touching lives far beyond the hospital's walls, proving that some storms come not to destroy, but to clear the air for something better to grow.